slideshow?
But then I can't see my notes.
We could do.
Sure. And then when you're done, just click back.
All right. Gotta raise this up. Sorry. Welcome, everyone. We're going to get started here. So my name is Jason Gambatese with EPA Region 9, and I have been in the Tribal Drinking Water Program since 2014 and worked with the State Drinking Water Program for the previous 15 years before that. And I will be presenting today with the wonderful Emma Young, who we recently joined our program.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Emma Young, and as Jason mentioned, I just joined our tribal infrastructure team. So I'll be working on our new infrastructure team for drinking water and wastewater projects. And I will be presenting on the service line inventory funding that we have available through bill.
All right. So what Emma didn't mention is she recently switched over from enforcement division. So I guess she traded in her stick for a carrot. So, all right. So as Emma said, we're going to talk about service line inventories today and the funding associated with that. So just a little bit of background on where this is coming from. This requirement came out of the lead and copper rule revisions that came out in 2021. That rule became effective in December of 2021 and has a compliance deadline of October 16th, 2024, which is a very important deadline for this work. However, we are currently working on a new regulation called the Lead and Copper Rule Improvements that will change a lot of what's in the LCRR, but mostly not touch this service line inventory requirement that we're going to be talking about. That rule hopefully will be final before October 16th, 2024. Okay, so to get on the same page here, I want to talk about what a service line is, so we're all thinking of the same thing. So in this picture, it illustrates this line going from the water main in the street to the home. And the line is basically that entire length of pipe with a few caveats. So we are going to be talking about kind of different sides of the line. We're going to talk about the line from the main to the sidewalk, which is where you might have a meter or a curb stop. We call that the public side of the line. And then the line from the meter, curb stop to the home would be what we call the private side of the line. Now, some utilities may have that little crooked piece of pipe near the water main. We call that a gooseneck. That could be made of lead. For the purposes of the inventories, that is not part of a service line, but it is something we're concerned about if it is made of lead. So before we get into this, why do we care about service lines? Well, the main thing is we're trying to find if there's any lead out there. And the best way to deal with lead exposure in drinking water is to get the lead out. To borrow a line from the previous presenter, we all know lead is gross, so we don't want lead in water. So do we expect to find lead in any of our tribal communities? We don't think so. We haven't come across it to date, but that doesn't mean it's not there. And more importantly, it doesn't mean it wasn't there in the past. I'm going to talk about the different categories that we're going to identify lines as, and you'll see why historical lead may be a concern as well as current lead. Okay, so as I mentioned, there's that important deadline coming up. It's less than a year away now. And It's October 16th, 2024. And depending on what you submit to us on that date will determine your future actions beyond that date. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that will look like as well. Okay, so here are the 4 categories you have to categorize every single service line in your water system under. And this includes active and inactive lines. So the first one is lead. That one's obvious. Pipe is made of lead. Straightforward, it's a lead pipe. The second one is the complicated one. This is where historical lead may come into play. And we call this galvanized requiring replacement, or GERS. And so a GER is where on the private side, remember that's from the sidewalk to the house, there's a galvanized service line. And then on the public side, from the main to the sidewalk, it was lead in the past, or it has an unknown history because the records of the entire life of that line are not available. So in that case, we call that a GER, and that's something that is also mandatorily going to have to be replaced, just like a lead line. Why is that important? Because galvanized lines contain iron, and iron will absorb lead. So if there was a lead source upstream of that pipe, that galvanized line over time will essentially become like a lead line and be a source of lead. Even if that upstream lead source was removed 20 years ago, that galvanized line is still a health concern. So that's going to be something all water systems will have to replace at some point. The third category is non-lead. This is what we think most of our systems will be. This is basically a plastic pipe or a copper pipe. Before I jump to the last one, well, let me jump to the last one first. So the last category is lead status unknown. You don't have the records, so you have no way to verify what that pipe material is. So to complete your inventory, by that October 16th deadline, you have to submit to us a list of all your service lines and identifying them in one of 4 categories. So it's okay to send in an inventory with unknowns at this point, but there will be ramifications if you have unknowns, as well as ramifications if you have GERS and if you have lead lines. Going back to the GERS though, speaking of missing information, like I said, we don't expect that there is currently lead. There probably wasn't lead in the past, but if you don't have documentation and you find galvanized on the private side and you have no documentation for the private side, we have to assume the worst case scenario and call that a GER. So in the absence of information, we're going to be conservative with our assessment. Okay. So you've submitted your inventory form by October 16th, 2024. That's great. I will say, like I said, that deadline's less than 10 years away, and to date, we've gotten less than 10% of our water systems to send this in at this point. So, we've been talking about this for a couple years now, and hopefully systems are working on it. RCAC's out there to help with water systems as well. But it's not just meeting that deadline in October. The other important aspect of this is funding, which is what Emma will talk about in her presentation. But the sooner you get this inventory in, or figure out where you stand with your inventory, the easier it will be to apply for funding and get to the front of the queue and get that money flowing and get the work happening. So if you get to that deadline in October next year and you're not 100% non-lead, what is that going to mean? Well, obviously, if you have lead lines or GER lines, the focus is on replacing those. If you have unknowns, the concern there is you don't have, an easy way to figure this out. You presumably went through all your existing records, and there's nothing left to do. All you have is pipe buried in the ground. The only way to see what that pipe is to dig it up and look at it with your own eyes. So it's not necessarily an easy task, but it's something we want systems to kind of get started on because it might take a while. And, if you go this route of saying, well, it's too much work to figure this out, we're going to just call everything unknown and at least check that box for next October and deal with it down the road. Well, here's the ramifications of what that's going to entail. You're going to have to send annual notices to these customers saying, hey, we don't know what your pipe is. It may be lead, so you probably should take precaution, but we can't say for sure it's not lead. So that's one thing. there are requirements to develop a replacement plan, because we're going to assume if it's unknown, it could be lead. So what is your plan to deal with replacing these lines? Because under the LCRI that I mentioned that's coming, there's going to be mandatory lead service line replacement, within a 10-year time frame. So you'll have to develop a plan on how you're going to get that accomplished. And as let's say you're in this boat and you develop that plan, and now you have to, replace 10% of your lines every year. What's going to happen is, if they're all unknown, but you think they're not lead, but you don't know, you go out there, you dig up your first line, and it's not lead. Well, you don't get any credit for that line. So you got to go to the next house, dig that up. Oh, it's not lead, no credit. And you can see where this is, soon becomes a huge waste of time and money. So we don't really want to go down that road, and we want systems to kind of get started on this activity now. Some other things, you're going to have to send a notice to customers on potential line disturbances. So if you have a lead line and that line gets disturbed through, flushing or some type of construction activity in the area, that could release lead particulate matter off the pipe and then get trapped in a kitchen aerator and be a source of lead. If it's an unknown but plastic line, obviously that's not going to happen. But again, we don't know what it is, so we're going to assume the worst. So you have to tell customers, hey, we did this disturbance. You might want to, take precautions at your home. And then down the road, once the new rule kicks in, if you have action level exceedances, that's going to trigger further activity on those homes in particular that are listed as unknown. And then finally, you have to offer up sampling to any of these homes if they're interested, even if they're not, part of your normal sample pool. Okay, so let's get back to identifying the lines. This language here is basically straight from our regulations, and it kind of lists the acceptable documentation. Basically all the stuff you would imagine, like as-built or construction records, or maybe something IHS has on file. Those kind of things. I mean, as you all know, state permits and construction or plumbing codes don't apply on tribal lands. I mean, they can be useful tools to help you kind of guide your identification of these, but we can never guarantee that those permits or codes were followed in the construction on tribal land. So, what's the practical approach for a water system that we think, on tribal lands that we think is going to happen? So you're going to review all the documents that you have on file already. Maybe talk to IHS, see if they have anything that might be useful to you. Maybe you have information about the age of the homes. That's while that might not tell you what's in the ground, it might be what we call supporting documentation if that line ends up being an unknown. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that's going to entail. And maybe you've, through your years of digging up lines, you've come across different pipes in the ground, and you've made notes, and that's certainly useful information as well. And so collect all that and kind of see where your data gaps are, and then go from there. And so once you have your data gaps, then those are essentially your unknowns. And when we're looking at unknowns, we're looking at how are we going to identify them? The most likely way is through what we call potholing, where you basically shoot high pressure water into the ground, create a hole until you get down to the pipe, and then you could physically see what that pipe is with your own eyes. And to be considered a valid verification, we need to look at 3 portions of that pipe, and we're saying each portion should be 18 inches in diameter at least. And then you would choose two locations on one side of the pipe and 1 location on the other side. It's up to you what you want to do. I can guarantee you're going to encounter situations where homeowners may not want you drilling a hole on their property and stuff, so you may run into some resistance on the private side of the line. So that's one thing to kind of get ahead of and figure out what your limitations are in this work. The other way to look at this is to use that supporting documentation that I talked about, where maybe you have a bunch of known lines and the age of the home, or the builder or stuff like that, and you can compare it to your unknown lines and say, oh, this was the same builder, it was put in the same year, it's likely the same type pipe material. And so we could use that information to kind of make educated assumptions about what those lines may be. So the other thing that's part of this program is the lead ban. I mentioned that, you know, these state laws and permits and stuff don't necessarily apply on tribal land, but they're a good kind of gauge for what might have been happening at tribal water systems. So what we're looking at is when each of our states have banned lead in the 80s. And you see the dates up there. So based on that, those dates, we've decided that any water system, if you could prove that it was built after 1989, we'll basically blanketly say, okay, this system is non-lead. And the way we're doing that, the most common way, you can maybe have an as-built or something like that. Not everyone has that, but the one way where a lot of systems are using is using a satellite image. So you can go to Google Earth and go back in time essentially and look at old satellite images. They have the date on there. Let's say it was taken in 1994. It's pretty cool. And you know, for a system that was built in 2000 and you look at 1994 satellite image, you're going to see hopefully just an empty field or whatever. And you could say, look, you know, there was nothing there in 1994. So clearly we were built after 1989 and we get credit for being non-lead. So if you're in that boat, you have it pretty easy, but you still need to do that last step of kind of sending in that Google Earth image, outlining the service area of the system, so we know which area you're talking about, and you know, you've basically checked that box. We created a inventory form you can use to help complete your inventory. You're not required to use this, but it's a great tool, and it has all the fields that you'll need to fill out. This is just one side of the form. So this row in blue is the mandatory side. I didn't include the other side, which is green. That's optional. But basically, you know, you go through the top of the form, you fill out the information. One of the questions at the top is, was this system built after 1989? You check yes, and you provide your documentation, and then you're done with the form. If you can't, you know, meet that criteria, then you go down to below the blue row, and each service line would be a line on this form. However, if your system is made up of both old and new construction, and you have, say, like a subdivision that was built after 1989, we will allow you to, you know, list that subdivision under one line. So you see all the way at the end that number one. That number one represents how many service lines does this information represent. So if you have a subdivision with 50 service lines, you know, you just write whatever new subdivision, write down 50 there, and then it will count all those as non-lead automatically. So it's a pretty cool form. You should have gotten one of these. We emailed these out to all the water systems earlier this year. So if you have not gotten it, please reach out to your program manager. So I talked a little bit already about how to characterize these unknowns. So I'm not going to go too much into this, but I will say, if you do have unknowns, we want to see the inventory form filled out with those unknowns and sent to EPA before you start digging them up and doing all that extra work. Because if you get to the point where, you know, you say you have this homeowner that doesn't want you digging in their yard, well, what are you going to do there? Well, we're going to let systems, you know, not necessarily dig up 100% of their lines. We encourage it, we have the money for it, but we understand there could be limitations for it. So if you go into this situation where you can't identify, you know, physically dig up 100% of your lines, we're going to make these educated assumptions about those lines and call it, you know, what we think it would be. Now, if 10 years down the road, you do dig up that line and say, oh, we thought that was plastic, but it turns out to be galvanized, then, you know, that obviously assumption was wrong. So we want to go back and look at every single line that was identified through that similar assumption based on that initial inventory form you sent in and say, okay, we're going to reopen these 10 other lines as well and put them back in the unknown category until we can figure out what they may be. So that's why we want that initial form first showing those unknowns so we know which lines to reopen. And I'm passing it on to Emma now.
All right. Okay. Yeah, so I will be talking about our Region 9's Drinking Water Tribal Set-Aside Lead Service Line Replacement Funding Program. And this is funding through bill that we are receiving currently that can be used for service line inventories and lead service line replacement projects. So I will be going through the background. Jason just went through it in depth, so we'll kind of glaze over that and then go through the eligible projects, the funding methodology that we're using for this funding, and then the proposed process to utilize the funding through service line inventories, the investigatory work, and then any lead service line replacement projects that do come. And then I'll go through the guidance and proposal forms, and if there are any questions for both Jason and I, we can answer them. Okay, are we on the agenda or next one? Okay, cool. All right, so this is the funding that we received in fiscal year 2023. We received $26.5 million, and we do anticipate to receive the same amount of $26.5 million for fiscal year 2024. In fiscal year 2022, we received $18 million, and throughout the 5 years of the bill funding that we do plan to receive, we should be receiving about $125 million in total. So there's a lot of funding that we're receiving for these projects. So this is a slide. Jason did go through this in detail, but for this program, we are receiving funding to investigate and remove lead service lines. The projects must be drinking water tribal set-aside eligible, and it must be a lead replacement line project or an associated activity directly connected to identifying, planning, designing, and replacing lead service lines. Jason went through this, but the service line is defined as a lead service line that's made of lead, or a galvanized service line that requires replacement because it was previously or is currently downstream of an unknown or a lead service line. And then eligible components of this as well include lead goosenecks, pigtails, and connectors, whether standalone or connected to a lead service line. And then additionally, you may hear me say GERS, which is just the shorthand for galvanized requiring replacement. So the two types of projects that are eligible are the service line inventory projects, which are due to EPA on October 16th, 2024. This can include doing the service line inventory or any investigatory work to identify the unknowns. This can include mapping and in any investigatory work. We can provide technical assistance to small water systems that are undertaking the inventories. And in terms of the lead service line replacement project, like we did mention, we don't anticipate to find a lot of lead service lines, but never say never. So we do have funding for that as well. And this includes the lead containing goosenecks, pigtails, and connectors as well. We're also able to provide technical assistance to small water systems for the construction projects and the preparation of planning documents as well. And as we mentioned, the replacement projects do include the service line, both utility and privately owned. And then meters are not an allowable cost under this. So this is the proposed funding methodology. This just kind of goes through the different projects that are eligible. This was also what we presented in our tribal consultations. And the main point that I do want to emphasize with this is that we do plan to fund all projects that are eligible. We have a lot of money, so we really do want to get it out the door to you all. And then you can go through this yourself. It's also on our website. But I also just want to note that the possible requirements for planning documents prior to construction may include the description of the construction mechanism, timeline for completion, a detailed cost estimate, and any documentation that is required for the rights-of-way permissions. All right, and I will go over this slide many times in the presentation. This is really important about how we do plan to utilize the funding. But this is just what you can look at for your tribal water utility and how we will be going through the service line inventories, investigatory work, and then any potential replacement projects, planning, and then the actual construction. So the first portion of this is the service line inventory. And as Jason did go through that, if there are any questions specifically about it, we'll be able to answer. But we can provide technical assistance through contract services, and we do currently have a contract in place with RCAC. If the unknowns can be easily determined, we want systems to identify all of the materials in the service line inventory. And part of the initial service line inventory submission to EPA is identifying the scope of work and investigatory work that may be needed. For record reviews, RCAC is currently in contract with us and can assist with that. And then we do want water systems. If water systems do complete the initial service line inventories, they can actually conduct this work under the service line inventory component of the funding. But we will need to identify the scope of work, and the proposal will need to be received by EPA if you do plan to use this funding for the service line inventory. So after the service line inventory is initially done and submitted to EPA, you can submit a proposal, and any unknowns, if you need to do further record review or if you need to do any potholing or any physical on the ground work to identify and to visual the lines, then that can be part of this, and we do have funding for that. This is a great opportunity for tribes to utilize this funding through a direct grant from EPA in order to conduct compliance work to meet that deadline for the service line inventory that's in October of 2024. And through that grant, it can include an administrative work, funding for operators and staff to do the record reviews, or any additional investigatory work. Additionally, you can use an interagency agreement with IHS. We do need IHS and the tribe to be in agreement about that before the proposal is submitted, and that'll be part of the proposal that's submitted to EPA. And additionally, for contract services, if the scope of work does include records review, you can use the current contract with RCAC. But for anything that includes potholing or field inspections where digging or potential liabilities might occur, then we may need to use another contract. So if this is something that you think that your tribe or water utility will need to do, then you can definitely engage with me and with your program manager, and we can discuss kind of what services or contracts would fit for that. The pros of that is that the tribe would not have to conduct all the administrative work and oversight, but the cons is that there would be no reimbursement available to the operator, anyone who does have to be there for the contractor while they're conducting the work. And this will be the same submission process if there is a contractor that's needed, and whatever additional documentation we do identify in kind of our initial conversations, we'll make sure that that's part of the proposal that we receive. So as we mentioned, we do not anticipate a large amount of lead service line replacement projects, and lead service line replacement projects are only eligible once a lead service line, a GUR, or any eligible component is identified. In the service line inventories, if any of these components are identified, then you need to let us know as soon as possible so we can start to work with you on what the project scope would look like. And we may be able to kind of start the administrative components to accelerate the process for any replacement projects that are needed. But we really want to work on the service line inventories and identifying all of the components and unknowns initially so that we can kind of move through this funding methodology. Okay, and then this should be a slide. There is a QR code which goes to that link as well. And this is kind of our web page that's available for you. It has all of the information that's in this PowerPoint. And it has my contact information and our guidance and proposal form. So if you are interested in applying, this is a good resource for you. And in terms of the application process, once the proposal is submitted to EPA, we do expect about a 6-month timeframe turnaround. Once it's submitted, we'll have 2 months to review the applications for completeness and notify the applicants with requests for any additional information. And then the tribe will have a month to respond to our comments and anything that we do need in addition. And then the last step will be that any final documents for the grant, interagency agreement, or in-kind services, it'll be processed and the awards will be funded for the projects. And this is just a picture of the proposal form. This is also available on that webpage. And it's just kind of a simplified proposal form about the scope of the project, and then any additional documents that'll be submitted to me directly. And this is what's needed for the submissions. For all grants and interagency proposals, it must include the project proposal form, which was on the previous slide, and then tribal and government endorsement and a detailed cost estimate. For any of the lead service line replacement project proposals, there also will need to be some type of planning document, and we can work with you on what that might look like, and any other additional documents that will be needed for the planning of the project. We're also working to develop like a fact sheet, FAQs, and other documents that can be utilized by the tribal utility when you're out doing any of this work, to notify customers of the work that you're doing, help with right-of-ways. So if there is anything on this list or anything on this list that you don't see that you think would be really helpful, you can definitely reach out to us, and we'll be working on developing all of this and putting it on our webpage. All right, and if you have any questions for Jason and I, we are here. Thank you.
I actually have a question for you. As I said before, we have received less than 10% of the systems completing their inventory at this point. So I'm wondering if anyone wants to share any obstacles they may have encountered on getting that work done so far. Does anyone not have the inventory form?
Back in the early 2000s, we got a whole new water system from wells to pipes to tanks. So where would that put us? They changed everything up to the meter. All new service lines from the meter to the house, they didn't change.
So do you have records of that old pipe from the meter to the house?
Not records, but it was when they dug it up, we did, I guess, saw what it was. It was that black PE that IHS specs out.
Okay, and someone documented what they saw?
Probably not.
Okay.
But that's easy, just digging that up to prove that 4 or 5 homes maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like you're pretty close. It's just a matter of, putting pen to paper and filling out the form, so. I know John is busy working on with different water systems. I don't know, John, do you have anything to say? Like, I know you're visiting a lot, but I haven't seen any come in. So, what challenges are you having?
Challenges for me are when I pop out there, unavailable documentation. Basically, I start with looking at the Google Earth imagery, any type of imagery I can find, putting me back to that date of '89. Some of the Google Earth imagery is really ugly. I'll go ahead and say it. It's you really got to look extra hard to see where those homes are, some of that imagery. So the good imagery is somewhere around 92, 95 if you're lucky. So if you've got an ArcView GIS department, that you can find some old images, or they may have to buy imagery, because I remember when I did ArcView GIS, we could buy stuff and we could find an old image. So maybe that might be something that they could look into. But the unavailability of contracts, the schematics, they've got plans, they've got all this stuff, but there's nothing that confirms, you know what I mean? Yes, it was done. It was, aside from the contract. And I guess I'm a little gun shy to send you some of that information as well. So I know whatever we come up with the schematics, that's what we give you, but it's mostly unavailable information or time to prep. These guys are also busy, Jason. That's a big thing, is we get out there and things come up. So this is one of those projects that's not important until it's important tomorrow, is what I'm thinking. You know what I mean? So be flexible.
So I'll add, as Emma mentioned, you're looking at maybe 6 months from application to getting the money, and we're less than a year out. So, keep that in mind if you think you're going to need funding. And, you may be busy now, but if you send in, an inventory with unknowns, you're going to be even busier later with all the requirements that come with that. So keep that in mind.
Hi, Jason. I had a quick question. Do you guys have a one-page summary for outreach so that we can send it out to our residents? So that gives them a little bit of background and it helps them or educate them on what we'll be doing.
Yeah, we are working on like a fact sheet, just like a one-page two-sider. And so once we do have that, we are hoping that that can be utilized for outreach in the field and with customers or whoever. And it includes information about service line inventories and both the funding aspect.
Anything else?
No.
Good morning. I'm Ruby Altaha. I'm with the White Mountain Apache tribe. So we have an area. It's a recreation area. It's called Holly Lake. And there's cabin rentals up there. There's a store and just a small septic system, the water system. So this area was developed by non-Indian, non-members back in the 60s and 70s. So there's no records. We're working on, we receive a brownfields grant for abatement of cabins. We've been doing assessments, but there's no one working on this inventory. So where would I start? There's been changes at the tribe, so no one's addressing it, and how would that impact our operations, cabin rentals, fishing, camping in this area if we don't get this water line inventory done?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great opportunity for funding. If you were interested in submitting a proposal to identify those unknowns and to do the service line inventory, then that itself could be a project. So if you are still needing funding for doing that work, then this would be a great opportunity.
A letter was received. It didn't have a name. It was addressed. It was received at the tribe, and it showed up on my desk. So there's no name, and I tried to find a contact. I got the website now, so I have you people now to talk to. So we have no staff to do this. It's not considered a public community water system, so IHS is not involved. Our local utility is not involved. So since I'm the director for this nonprofit corporation that manages the cabin rental, I'm concerned that this needs to get done. So yeah, I'll need directions on what step one is for, for
Just to
our
be clear,
corporation.
this is a system EPA regulates?
Pardon me?
Is this a water system that EPA regulates? Okay.
We're on EPA's radar.
Okay.
So the water system is being treated, and so, yeah.
So I think your best option probably is trying to tap into that contract where, you request the funding and then we kind of manage the work from our side and send out a contractor and they start potholing or whatever they need to do. Any other questions?
Yes, my name's Jack Music. I'm from La Jolla Band of Indians, about 35, 40 miles north of here. Vice chairman for my tribe. I'd like to know that would funding be available for cemeteries and culture areas that have been there for several years, that we have water to those locations? We about know where the water lines are, but would there be funding available, like what you guys talked about earlier, in replacing those lines to those areas, not only homes? And I know we have about 225 homes on our reservation, and probably 55 of them are probably built in the early 1900s to 1950s. And those homes that are built after 89 or probably wouldn't be eligible, but the ones that are from the early, 1900 to 50s would be eligible. I was just wondering if we do scope of work and do a proposal, but with those cemeteries, we have 3 cemeteries on our reservation that have the old water lines, would they be eligible? And also we have an old tribal hall that has water too, that we rebuilt now to a senior center for our elders, but that has very old water lines in those areas also. Just a question if they would be eligible if we did a scope of work and a plan for those areas.
Yeah, so as long as the system is drinking water tribal set aside eligible, and any construction projects are in compliance with the lead and copper rule, then it should be an eligible project. The only caveat that there would need to be is any investigatory work would need to be directly connected to identifying any lead or GERS lines. And then if there was anything identified that would be in those categories, then it would be an eligible replacement project.
Yeah, just to add, so, you mentioned that you don't know where some of the lines are, so mapping of those lines would be an eligible cost, but like Emma said, if it doesn't turn out to be lead or GER, we can't replace those lines. Anything else?
All right, well, thank you very much. And if there are any more specific questions, my contact information is up there, and we'll be here all day. All right, thank you.